All right. Well, everyone, hello, welcome. It is our Lenten pilgrimage through the Baptismal Covenant. Remember, we're doing the 5 vows, 5 weeks, the I will with God's help. And we're almost halfway through. So halfway through this class, we'll be halfway through. That's the glory of 5 weeks. You can get two and a half in, and you're there. So let's check in a bit. One of the things that can happen, especially when a class is provocative for you, it churns up questions or it churns up observations. Is there anything that's kind of hit you in these moments, these couple of weeks that has been sort of worthy of note? Is there something that's kind of kicked off for you? I know you had a couple of questions. You want to throw a couple of those at me and see how I do?
I don't know how deep we can get. I guess one of the things that made me start thinking about stuff was like the apostolic succession.
Apostolic succession,
Yeah,
yeah.
that was real interesting. So I was like looking at other religions and how, you guys relate to that because that seems super important in the first class we had.
It is. I mean,
Yeah.
I think part of when we commit in the baptismal covenant to the apostles, will you keep the apostles' teaching and fellowship, the breaking of bread and the prayers? Um, it's a very arch question. It has a lot of import to it. Like you want to hear somebody who's got a kind of a baritone voice, intone it, or some deep sort of wise crone, sort of out of the mists, point a crooked finger at you and say, "Will you keep the apostles' teaching and fellowship?" But the core of this will you maintain continuity with all that we've been? And part of the great challenge, and Rosita's sermon on Sunday kind of hit it when she quoted, of all people, Nietzsche, the great atheist, which is, those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. It's a great example of this. Is part of the challenge of being a follower of Jesus is to understand that we're in relationship with people and with stories and with knowledge that goes all the way back.
Yeah.
It roots itself in our very understanding of what does it mean to be human. When I teach Sunday school and we talk about the book of Genesis, and we say in the beginning, God creating the world. There's an understanding, as I tell the kids, oftentimes you get caught up in, you think that this is a how question and answer. How did the world get made? And then you say, God did it this way. But really, it's us trying to explain to our children and ourselves why. Why do birds fly through the air? Why do fish swim through water? Why do we stand on the earth with 2 legs and cows walk on 4? Why is the sky blue? When the sun sets, what are those things that are lights in the sky that look like pinpricks in the side of a tent and the light shines through? What's beyond that? Is there a curtain and there's something beyond, like
Yeah.
trying to figure out why? And more importantly, when you talk about why are we mean to each other? Why do we all speak different languages? Why do we say this group of people are good and they aren't? Where does that come from? And what those early books of scripture try to do is try to tell the story of why. Why does God love the people of Israel in this unique and powerful way, the descendants of Abraham and the people who followed Moses out of Egypt and entered into the Holy Land, and with Joshua, and all these different things unfold? How does history make sense? And when we commit to a deeper understanding of that walk, and then we kind of follow through on that continuum, then Jesus, when he arrives, makes more sense, because when he arrives, he's coming on the heels of John the Baptist, who looks just like Elijah did or Moses did in the wilderness. It all makes contextual sense. And on top of that, when we hear the voice of one crying in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord, we're hearing the prophet Isaiah. Like, it all hangs together. It all makes cohesive sense. So that when Jesus is raised from the dead, and we as Christians start to experience a greater sense of continuity with Christ in our lives, then we see that apostolic succession really, it's not just that it matters for legitimacy, it also gives us a sense of meaning, a sense of connection and purpose.
Yeah.
The other piece of this, and this is, we're going to talk a little bit about this tonight when we talk about proclaiming by word and deed the good news of God in Christ, is that it directly impinges upon on how we are. How are we hardwired as people who follow Jesus? Um, as you read the scriptures and experience this kind of what's called kerygma, it's a Greek word meaning body of knowledge. As you absorb this kerygma, you start to realize that it's kind of like a genie in the bottle. In the best sense of the word, it bursts out and it seeks to expand. Like you can't just keep it contained, and you can't keep it restricted. It's about welcoming. It's about sharing. It's about giving. It's about inviting and connecting with people, which can be very daunting because a lot of people, when they think about faith, they think about it this way, I'm going to keep it, one of the great things is that a lot you hear from a lot of people is I'm spiritual but not religious, which means, I find God in me or in my dog or in my walk in the morning, which is you find a sense of the divine, but when it doesn't connect you to people, it also doesn't carry you beyond yourself in relationship to others.
Mm,
How can it unite you to God?
right.
That's not me condemning. That's me sincerely asking the question, like, what is it about your profession of faith that leads you more profoundly and deeply into relationship with the divine? And if with the divine, then the other, whoever the other may be.
Right. That's interesting.
So apostolic succession, yeah, it's important. Any other pops?
It's powerful.
Yeah.
Like the Russian Orthodox, I was reading about how they do it's like laying hands with their bishops, the same kind of thing. But then I didn't realize other religions like Presbyterians and Methodists, they don't have that.
No,
And that's a big
actually,
difference.
and one of the things about us as Episcopalians entering into profound communion with Lutherans and Methodists, we have to figure that out. One of the interesting things about Lutheranism is that they've changed the way they do bishops. Used to be bishops were elected for a term. Now they're made bishops, but when they're made bishops, an Episcopal bishop is involved. So we're kind of full, like like when you make a dessert, and you have whipped cream, you have to fold it in, otherwise it flaps all the bubbles. Folding in that apostolic succession as we go, so we're more profoundly linked.
It's important. I think so. Gives
Yeah.
it legitimacy. I think.
Absolutely, absolutely. Any other observations? That was a good one. Good and coherent to what we're doing.
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure, Jonathan.
I think it's kind of on this point. When you talk about apostolic succession, I guess what I think about also is the relationship of the Episcopal Church to the Reformed tradition.
Mhm.
And so like, I'd appreciate any comments you have on that. And also what you think of, because I guess the correct me if I'm wrong, but the Reformed tradition tends to kind of reject that, right? And I think, and I could be wrong on this, but do correct me, right? So, and I guess the other part is like, the other part of this isn't just like a question about just like an academic question. It's more also a question about, I think what you're talking about, our relationship with God. Like how, like where does the authority with our relationship with God lie, I guess. I think that there's different views on that. Like if there's a kind of a traditional sort of understanding of that comes through maybe this apostolic succession and the tradition of the church, or if it's more direct, I guess. I don't know if that question makes sense or how. If it doesn't make sense, let me know. But if it does, I'd appreciate your comments on that.
So the first one I hear is, how does the Episcopal Church, we've talked in the apostolic succession ideal, how it relates to our Catholic tradition.
Yeah.
Looking at, Catholicism and Orthodoxy as sort of the axes by which the church sort of sees itself. And then comes along the Reformation, Martin Luther and the rest, and you're kind of challenged with this idea that it isn't just the tradition of the
By
church.
grace through faith alone or something, by grace, right.
Right. Sola gratia, sola, yeah. So only grace can really save us. Sola gratia. But which is fun because then we turn it into Latin and make it sound really beautiful. But the other piece of this is that and kind of the way you frame this, Jonathan, is a great exposition of this weird admixture that is Anglicanism, because we are, as my ordaining bishop said, and he had that big bass voice. He wanted to hear him read the Bible, very deep bass. And he said, we are a church in the Reformed Catholic tradition, which I think it kind of hits all the bases as you describe that, Jonathan. And I'll break it out. So it's not just a 3-word trifecta. Oh, that's great. I said it. Now it's done. So Reformed Catholic tradition. So we acknowledge our Catholicism with our emphasis on the sacraments, the understanding that baptism and what's called the ordinal, the orders of ministry of deacons, priests, and bishops, the Catholicity of reconciliation, all the sacraments, reconciliation, unction, Eucharist, baptism, the ordination process, marriage, and I'm missing one, reconciliation. There it is. But you look at those 7 and you say, yeah, that exists. At the same time, we also look at ourselves as reformed. So the church politic, or the church militant, the present church, the way it's constructed, me and my collar, standing at the baptismal font, beckoning you guys to join in, inviting you to the table, existing only unto itself as a tradition isn't all of it. It's also about your own reasonable hope and experience of the grace of God's love. And that's where it hooks, is that so there's this grace of God's love piece, and then there's this reasonable faith or reasonable hope, which is really interesting because it isn't just the fact that you're expected to accept. The idea is that you're expected to engage. So God made this amazing thing between your ears called a brain that reasons and images and invokes and invents and creates and fires off and remembers and is its own unique portal onto the world, perceiving things. And the expectation, as Anglicanism has sort of developed over time with the Enlightenment, with the Reformation, and with the Catholicity of the church developing, as I roll back, puts us in a position where if we take all that and put it in the soup pot, what comes out is this incorporated thing. So we are reformed. We recognize grace. We put a book of common prayer in your hands that is in a language you can apprehend. We give you the scriptures in a language you can read. We expect that a member of the congregation participates fully. We say that there are orders of ministry, and the priest stands up there and takes the elements and they become the body of Christ. Isn't that wonderful? But it's not true until someone says amen, who's not the priest.
Mm.
So it's kind of all that folded in and creating that mix. And Jonathan, your question is great, because I have a colleague who would affirm what you're saying about the Reformed aspect of the Episcopal Church, and said that the Episcopal Church is an essentially Reformation faith. It was born of the Reformation and is of the Reformation, and even the manifestation of things like apostolic succession and people who affirm our Catholicity, that's lovely, but we're a Reformed church. So, if that makes sense. So the challenge for us is to really perceive ourselves as becoming engaged in this life in this way, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it's a start where I would want to, continue to probe. I won't do it here because there's a lot of, I know you want to cover a lot, but yeah, I mean, it makes sense. I think it's I think, how grace is mediated to us, I think is kind of a fascinating issue for me. And I just, that's kind of where that derives from. Yeah, your answer makes sense.
So I'll throw you a couple books because it sounds like you're a big history fan. And one of those is a guy named William Franklin, who's a bishop of the Episcopal Church. He was my church history professor. And William Franklin's book is called The Case for Christian Humanism. It's a textbook that I read in seminary, but it's good. The Case for Christian Humanism. And that's for, all y'all to kind of chew on. Then there's one that's really kind of esoteric, and if you're not feeling like reading sort of Shakespeare English, I'll adjure you from it. You don't have to. But Richard Hooker was the great framer of Anglican ethos, and he wrote a bookshelf of books called The Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity.
Oh, wow.
And Jonathan, I will point you to book 5. Or book 4 if you want, but book 5 especially. Book 5 of that is a good one for you. So book 5 of the Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, if you're feeling it.
Okay, I wrote those down.
Great. Okay. All right. So, and again, part of this, as you describe it, is like, there's Google, and go learn things. That's one, and form and articulate questions. My grandmother I come from a long line of educators and teacher educators. My mother's mother was a school principal. She was a teacher. Her mother before her taught in schools. And then my mom was a very formidable teacher educator, scholar of education. The line for this is, the only dumb question is the one that isn't asked. That's the only dumb question there ever is, because every question leads to the discovery. You think this is a dumb question. It isn't true. You have something to offer. You have something to engage. And it's a great opportunity. So we're here to do this next portion of the Lenten pilgrimage. This today is a little lighter. So we're going to kind of take it a little bit easier, but we're still going to cover some ground, but it's going to make a little bit more of a coherent, how do I engage this? So the next question is, will you proclaim by word and example the good news of God in Christ? And the answer is, I will, with God's help. So after we've sort of committed to learning things and being connected to things, and then realizing that we're not that great at holding on to things, and we need to say sorry about not keeping all the things up, and saying, God, you're good, please forgive me. And God saying, well, yeah, sure, I forgive you. And why don't you just take a little bit of this redemption on? Not only are you loved, but you're lifted up, which is really, really a struggle for many people. It's one thing to say, I love you back and all that. It's another thing to say, I love you, and then actually admit that feeling, to feel that sense of redemption, and to really let it land and hit. And when we do that, what it does is it basically puts us into a very humble state of being. Like, just as I am, O Lord, without one plea. There's another one, that 7 whole days, not 1 in 7, I will praise thee. It's this sense, these are the Anglican poets that offer these words. You have an opportunity in the midst of all of this forgiveness and love to realize that not only are you the recipient of this grace, this redemption, but also now you got to do something about it. You can't just sit with it. Like, isn't that lovely? I talk about loving ministry in New Jersey for a number of reasons, but one of those is pizza. And everybody who's not from New Jersey doesn't quite understand that, but everybody from New Jersey goes, oh yeah. I'll say, Peter, where do you get your pizza?
Where do I used to Swan Tavern. That's where I grew up.
Right.
Best pizza.
Right.
Now we go where, Trattoria? We go lately. Yeah.
But see, you can tell it's an in-between pizza, isn't it?
Yeah.
Where was your pizza growing up?
In Carlos Pizza by South Amboy.
Yeah. So, and then for us, we during the pandemic, we changed pizza places. So we were going to Villaggio's in South River for the longest time, but then some friends turned us on to Maria's in Milltown. And then you start to debate kinds of pizza.
Right,
Well, if you want a grandma's pizza, you got to go to the DuSal's.
right,
But if you want to just have a straight soft crust, if you want foldable, it's this, it becomes semantic. But the understanding is like we take pizza so seriously that it's almost like theology. And on top of that, because we care deeply and passionately about this, we will go to great lengths to tell you where the best is, right? Because we are converted and convicted to say that's where I get my pizza. And we also know that there are 10,000 pizza places between there and the place where you should go. So as a result of that, our testimony is not only to the benefit of maintaining and lifting up that pizza place, but also to being able to share that good news with other people. And you can't do that by telling somebody else their pizza is not good, can you? I'm sure that's great pizza, but have you tried Carlos?
Right.
And that's the great challenge is how do you frame that? And what does it do? It renders you into somebody who says this is a humble expression, and humble is a very powerful thing. Because it takes with it humility, but it also understands that what has been lost has been found, what has been broken has been mended, what has been torn down is being raised up. And that's us coming to terms with that. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. Like, why is that so resonant continually for people? It's because it's true, but also that if it teaches us that redemption and salvation is not something, and I want to stress this, and this is where one of the reasons I love being Episcopalian, it is not something that is restricted or reserved to anyone. It is in fact God's free gift, and we are just vessels communicating that, which is profoundly disturbing in some ways, because right when we think we've kind of settled into a good place with God, God goes ahead and churns us up again. There's a great image of Jesus going to visit someone at the waters of Bethesda, a man who's been paralyzed for over 30 years. And he's very frustrated because he has no one to come and take and lower him down into the waters, that when the angel comes down annually to stir it up and people go in to get healed, he's always the last one in. By the time he gets there, the waters are still. And on top of that, no one will help him. So Jesus basically tells him, your faith has made you well. Get up and go. Take your mat and walk. And he does. It's a kind of healing that is not just reserved to him, because the minute people encounter him, they say, why are you carrying your mat? By the way, he healed him on the Sabbath. You're not supposed to do stuff like that. Well, the man who healed me told me to carry my mat. It's upsetting things, this proclaiming the good news. And that's challenging to us. Now, I want to talk about testimony and testifying. I grew up in a community where I had friends that were in holiness traditions. I had friends that were in Pentecostal traditions, friends that were in the Wesleyan church and all that. And there was this great guy who was one of our youth pastors, Pastor Bob. And we would get together with friends every Wednesday night at my buddy's church and play basketball. And then he'd sit down and talk to us about Jesus. Great youth model, worked great. But one of the things that I found very disconcerting as a little Episcopalian kid is that he always told us, when you get to church tomorrow, testify to your friends. Bring your testimony to school tomorrow. And I was like, I'm 14 years old. I don't even know what it is to stand up straight. And I'm trying to figure out what my testimony will be. Because the way I grew up, testimony happened in church. That someone would stand up in the pulpit and preach. And it looked like Jesus is doing here in the synagogue in Capernaum in this picture. That's what testifying is. You're in a place where everybody agrees that what's going on is church, and that somebody stands up who's prepared something for presentation, and boom, that's it. And that's not necessarily what we're talking about, because testimony itself, another word for testimony in the ancient Greek is martyr. Martures means to be a witness. A martyr is a witness. Now, when you hear martyr, what do you think of? That's not a rhetorical question. What do you think of martyr?
I think of someone who gives their life for something
Right.
that they think is for the greater glory of whatever.
So there are beasts involved, burning stakes, hooks.
Yeah.
Yeah. Something privating, something painful, usually depriving somebody of breath.
Yeah,
Yeah.
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 And other ideas,
Someone else.
right?
Yeah.
But what if martyrdom means witness? It's pure and simple. There were these amazing martyrs that I grew up with, and one of the things I love is sometimes going back to my hometown newspaper, the Athens, Ohio Messenger, and in the obituaries, there were these lovely saints who were made their witness. They were these little old grandmas and great grandmas who you would be told that they passed away. They are survived by their children, their grandchildren, their great grandchildren, that sometimes their great great grandchildren. And in one case, a friend of mine's great 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 grandmother was still alive, so they had multiple generations. She was a member of ex-Baptist church, and she read the Bible 17 times, meaning she sat down and started it in the beginning, and she got to Amen, and then she went back and started over, and that's her obituary. She read the Bible 17 times. That's her testimony. That's what she's doing to testify. Or it may be simply, I'm your friend, and I'm going to sit here with you as you struggle. Uh, it could be any form. So martyrdom isn't necessarily about having your life taken from you. It can be simply being willing to risk telling the story and your witness to it. Now we're going to talk about some people who have things to say. And it goes back to this thing of what does it mean to be a preacher, or to proclaim? Like we have this image. That's our good old friend St. Peter again. You see the little haircut? That's always the indicator. The haircut and the beard is a dead giveaway. And Peter is preaching. This is in the Acts of the Apostles. And he's giving his big speech in the second chapter where he gives basically the story of Jesus's resurrection and why they're in Jerusalem and what it's all about and what it's going to look like. And it's a really good sermon. I urge you to go read it. That said, a sermon given by a preacher is not necessarily a proclamation of faith. We affirm it as that, we accept it as conventional, but we also are challenged as what do we do and where do we proclaim? I always say this, and again, we talked about pizza a minute ago. I'm going to talk about the other big thing in New Jersey, left turns. Right? We show our patience and our witness when we're trying to make a left turn or we're about to go through straight and we motion somebody through. Why? Because we're creating a safe space for them to go through and travel. One of the places I struggle with in that is that, it can be very nerve-wracking because it causes a disruption in the flow around you. But in that moment, there can be peace. So that's one aspect. I also tell people when we talk about by word or by deed, proclaiming the good news of God. I had a buddy of mine. He's now a moderator in the Presbyterian Church, sort of like a bishop. He's a moderator in the Presbyterian Church in Ohio. He is an amazing pastor. One of my great sadnesses is that he didn't become an Episcopal priest. He was actually thinking about it, but he's very good where he is in his Presbyterian roots. And his great line is, live your life in such a way that it begs the question. He was a youth pastor for me, and so he was teaching our youth. And he talked about Pastor Bob saying, go witness. He says, live your life in such a way that it begs the question. And I remember a young woman in my youth group, she's now a pediatric research oncologist. And she was talking about, what does that mean? And he gave me the best example, Mean Girl Land. You are walking down the hallway in high school and a mean girl she is mean to you, right? Straight up, as only the truly mean girl can be. And your friend is standing next to you and you turn and you forgive her. And your friend looks at you afterwards and goes, why did you do that? And you get to say, I'm glad you asked. And now you get to proclaim by word and deed why it is you engage in this forgiving action. It also turns into something basic. By the way, it also doesn't have to be meme-worthy. Yes, it's wonderful that somebody paid for your Dunkin' Donuts order and that you paid for somebody else's. Not necessarily a Christian witness, but it is a kindness. However, if someone's struggling and you offer them assistance and they say thank you. Again, live your life in such a way that begs the question, how can I thank you? Come to church on Sunday. You should see my church. If you think I'm welcoming, you should meet them. They're much better than me. That's another way to look at it. Make the time. The other piece of this, and I love this image, this is actually a line drawing by Rembrandt. A lot of people think of him as the great painter. He was also an amazing sketch artist. And he was incredibly obsessed with biblical images. Many painters of his era were. And this is one of my favorites. This is Jesus healing Peter's mother-in-law. So there's this great moment after Jesus has asked Peter and Andrew and James and John to come follow me and I'll make you fish for people. And then Peter and Andrew invite Jesus back to the house to have an evening meal. And Peter's mother-in-law, who with his wife would be responsible for extending hospitality to the people who are guests, was not able to rise. And so Jesus takes her by the hand and she gets up and begins to serve. And you think to yourself, why don't you just let her rest? Well, the problem is in that culture that day, she couldn't have just rested. But the fact that he took her hand and healed her allowed her to participate. How do we proclaim the good news? When people question Jesus, are you the Messiah? He gets the opportunity directly, living as if he begs the question, to answer, I'm the Messiah. Instead, he says, this is for John the Baptist, who sends his disciples to ask. He says, go and tell John that the sick are healed, the blind are having their sight restored to them, the poor are having good news proclaimed to them, prisoners are being proclaimed for release, and the dead are being raised. That's, if you want, know them by their works, basically. That's another way we can do this. Jesus expels unclean spirits. Jesus engages and models the kingdom work which is happening on God's time and not on the expectations, the agendas of human institutions around him. Provocative actions sometimes can put us in conflict, but ultimately, if we're faithful and caring, we can kind of hopefully lead ourselves back into that. That's the challenge, though, and you understand now why martyrdom has now become an idea of witness, because there are certain points where making that Christian witness becomes incompatible with being a good citizen of the Roman Empire or being considered an obedient person in society. And then people start to have to pay the price of that witness, that integrity. So it's a both-and thing. The other piece of this is, let's look at our old patron, Peter. Life gets complicated for him very quickly because he's trying to walk a middle way between the reform movement, Jonathan, sticking with you word there, the reform movement that's happening in Jerusalem in the synagogues. And so a lot of people think that the Jesus way is there to reform Judaism. Well, we would think of it as Judaism. They just think of it as being themselves. But there are others who we're going to get to in a minute, like St. Paul, who are very actively into welcoming people who are not Jewish into the synagogue and into the fellowship, but not requiring them to convert to Judaism. So we're doing something new. Peter winds up in a position of literally being suspended between the two of those in conflict. And things are very difficult for him because he's one of the ones who will spend time with Gentiles and talk about Jesus, but then still goes to the synagogue and preaches and does his best to keep the practices of kashrut, the dietary restrictions, the laws of Judaism that he was born to and grew up with, while at the same time sharing the story of the good news. Turns out you can't do both and in the Acts of the Apostles. Paul then winds up calling him out to his face, and there's a lot of argument involved in that. So I point to this book called The Acts of the Apostles as a really great template of what it means to try to figure out what it means to be a proclaimer and a doer of the word. It could be challenging. And of course, then we get to this big thing about the conversion of Paul, who was born Saul, and we're going to talk about him now. So the challenge, I love this image of the conversion of St. Paul. And you guys remember this from Sunday school at all? So Saul was present at the killing of St. Stephen, the deacon, the first martyr. Stephen was directed by the apostles, along with 6 other men, to oversee the distribution of support to widows and orphans in the community. They had a common purse, and people who were particularly in need would receive support from that. And their job was to oversee the distribution of assistance. Meanwhile, the apostles could think about what they're going to preach on Sunday, basically. Now, Stephen, not only did he do that, but he also was a pretty good preacher. And he stirred up the crowd a bit. So he got in trouble and wound up being stoned to death for it. Saul, who was a Pharisee of the time and sort of kind of way adjacent, like he was aware of it, but he wasn't happy about it. He was a very, very disciplined Pharisee. He was a person who kept the law, literally religiously. And at the same time, was really involved in the correction of people when they stumbled. So he was present at Stephen's murder. He held the cloaks of the people who were throwing rocks and brickbats at Stephen's head. And according to the scriptures, he approved of the killing. Right, not long after that, it comes to the church, the synagogues of Jerusalem, that the way, this Jesus thing, has infected the synagogues in Damascus in Syria. And so Saul receives a license to suppress, very 007. He is going to travel from Jerusalem to Damascus with a little cohort of bodyguards, and he is going to correct the heck out of the synagogues and drive out the followers of the way and purge them and get them back on the road. On the road to Damascus, lo and behold, he has the very first Damascus road experience. A bright light shines in his eyes, knocks him off his horse, or knocks him to the ground, depending on how you read the Greek. And he is asked by a voice that claims to be Jesus, "Why are you persecuting me? Don't you know it hurts to kick against the goads?" When he rises, you see the picture of Saul, I'm sorry, kind of sitting there holding his eyes because now they burn. He can't see anything. So instead of going into Damascus as this avenging paladin of Pharisaism, he goes in there as a broken man. And at the same time, a Christ-believing man, Ananias, receives a direction in a dream to go to Saul and care for him and nurture him and help him heal. Eye infections were very common, and the levels of care for people who had struggles with their eyes was actually a working man's talent. Like you had a craft to help people fix their sight. And that was one of the things that he was good at. So he went to Saul and they started to have this conversation. It took a while for the treatment. And Saul experiences conversion into Paul. Ananias becomes somebody he was really a target for Saul's persecutions. He becomes an informant of Paul's conversion to Christianity. And in the midst of this, Paul becomes a very passionate proclaimer of the word to the Gentiles. To say that he has a 180 is a complete understatement. When the scales fall from his eyes and he can see again clearly, he heads out with a guy named Barnabas. They go to Cyprus. They go the letters of Paul go all over the place because he's all over the place and he's traveling. But he and Peter struggle with that. So I'll tell this thing about the context of conversion experiences and proclaiming the word in Saul's context, because everything we can intend for our lives can be upended by the love of God. And what we intended one way finds out we're going this direction. God says, I know I told you to just, be a Christian, feel good about it. Have you ever been to Alexandria, Virginia? Right, when you were born. It was like suddenly now it's like, wait a minute. No, I wasn't intending to travel for this. I wasn't intending. Why am I having to risk now? Well, because you can't just keep it in a box. This gets us back to our beloved friend Peter, another great story from the Acts of the Apostles. Peter is struggling over the fact of what it means to be a proclaimer and apostle of Jesus Christ. He is seeking to proclaim in word and deed the good news of God. And he's at the core centerpiece of this debate on whether Gentiles would be admitted. One day he is in a house and he has been with this community for a while. He's been preaching the gospel and he's taking a nap up on the roof of the house. This was a way to get out of the heat of the day, to have a breeze. And he's famished. So he wakes up from his nap and he's starving. And I love this. And he sees a cloth lowered from heaven full of all kinds of unclean beasts, things you should not eat. And he is told by a voice, Peter, kill and eat. And he says, I won't, because I have never eaten any of those things. Lobster, pork roast. We joke about this. Taylor ham pork roll. You know, you define what it is.
Taylor.
Pork roll.
Girl,
Right. Oh, wow. Mixed marriage. That's impressive.
I have no idea.
You know, Rangers, Devils.
So,
Oh, dear. Yeah. So in this context, it's, and the struggle for this is it going to be a practical thing, a praxis thing where, you know, you practice Judaism and then you're a follower of Jesus? Or is it a doxis thing where you praise the name of Jesus and experience that involvement in the community? On top of that, there's something liberative that goes on with what's happening between Paul and Peter and James and the others, where they say, maybe we don't need to keep this thing locked down. Maybe it's not about that. Maybe it's something expansive. Peter having this vision to get up and eat bacon is not just because it's time to eat bacon, although we'd all agree bacon's a good thing. Deeply and more profoundly, it's how do we experience and receive the invitation to be a witness? Because at the very moment he wakes from his dream, there's a knock on the door, and 3 attendants of a centurion, a Roman centurion named Cornelius, are inviting him to come to Cornelius's house to tell him about Jesus. Live your life in such a way that it begs the question. And so Peter's experience challenges us. It's like when we see a man like him who labors to keep the dietary laws, to not break the rules, if he's willing to cross thresholds and borders, to be in relationship with people, to have a meal together, to share and be with these people and be one instead of separate, then what does that mean for us in our embrace of others? You know, when I was challenged about doing bilingual worship here, I had a parishioner who was very much minded of wanting to make sure that we welcome all, saying, but I want to hear. She said this very explicitly, I'm quoting it directly, but I really want to hear the prayers in the language I understand. And I said to her, we all do.
yeah.
Which, you know, you think to yourself, well, yeah, of course. But then you realize, no, then that means, and I joke with a friend of mine, that means I got to start learning some Filipino now. You know, that means I've got to start working on my French again, my Dutch, my you know, my Urdu. You know, we have an opportunity to expand ourselves in our relationships with each other when we're willing to cross lines and borders and boundaries to get there. Now, I wish Kate was here because I got some really neat people to share with you now. So I want to give you some examples of this. My first one for you is an amazing Anglican priest. Her name is Florence Lee Timoy. And talking about being an example, she is an absolute rock star of what it means to cross borders and boundaries and to be a proclaimer of the good news of God and Jesus Christ. She was a very passionate Anglican in Singapore. And when the Japanese occupation of China happened, a curtain fell across the Christian communities that were normally united to each other, Singapore, Hong Kong, Beijing, and points north. And it became very difficult for anyone to travel from one community to the other, particularly Anglo men who were clergy, which was the dominant construct of that. So the people that were behind Japanese occupation lines could not receive the sacraments. They weren't able to have people baptized. They weren't able to have the Eucharist. They weren't able to experience marriages, to have reconciliation, to have confession and things like that. And so she, as a Chinese woman, could travel relatively sort of under the radar of the Japanese soldiers. And Bishop Hall, who was the bishop in China at the time, and the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time was a man named William Temple, who was an absolute rock star of an archbishop. He actually once said that the church, and I'm talking about the whole church, not just Episcopal Church of the Anglican Communion, but the body of Christ is the only human organization that exists entirely for the benefit of people who are not its members, or not yet its members, depending on how you read the history. I mean, you know, we exist for the other. And Temple and Hall sort of collabed on this and came to the conclusion that if Florence could travel to these places, why couldn't she take the sacraments? Why couldn't she deliver those sacraments to people? Why couldn't she do baptisms? Why couldn't she do that? And it turns out in secret that Bishop Hall ordained Florence to be a priest in the 1940s during World War II. There were no women who were being ordained at that time. None, except her. And so as a priest, and you see this in this icon, she would travel across China as a priest and lead worship and preach the gospel and teach and do baptisms and celebrate the Eucharist and do all those things. And this was agreed as to be a good thing during this time of extremis. Now, when World War II ended and it kind of got out that there was a woman priest, she did an even more rock star thing because the church wasn't quite ready for that. She embraced a voluntary suspension of her orders. She didn't give them up, but she basically suspended herself and didn't do anything for the next 30 years as a priest until women's ordination was regularized in the 1970s. So before there were women priests and deacons and all that, before there were women bishops, there was this woman who basically said, I need to go from here to there and be a witness in word and deed. I want to tell you about another lady who's as cool, if not more so in some ways. You see that lady standing next to those two Seminole men?
Mm-hmm.
Her name is Harriet Bedell. She was born in the late 19th century, and in Western New York. She heard missionary preachers come to her church and invite people young men mostly, to go on missions. And she decided she wanted to do that in her life. She didn't want to get married. She didn't want to teach school. She wanted to go off and be a missionary. And her mother didn't want her to travel overseas. So she studied and became a member of what's called the Order of Deaconesses. These were women who committed themselves to a life of service and prayer in the church. They weren't quite ordained, and they weren't really nuns. They were sort of in between. And as a maiden lady, because she couldn't go overseas, you know where she went instead? And this is in the 1880s. She went to Oklahoma, to Cherokee territory, and she worked there for a decade until tuberculosis forced her to quit for a time and go to Colorado to a sanatorium so that she could be, so that she could have healing. And you think, wow, that's amazing. What a career that was. Then she turns around, and in 1916, she travels to Alaska, to the Aleutian Islands and to the Upper Yukon, and spends the next 15 years of her life working amongst Native Americans there. And she built a school, she had clinics. Unfortunately, she worked among Athapascans. So first she learns how to speak Cherokee. She actually got a Native American Cherokee name. They called her Bird Woman, because she was so slight and little, and at the same time, she could fly for great distances, they said.
Yeah.
So, and then among Athapascan in the Yukon and the Aleutian regions, she did all this. Eventually, her school closed because it came during the Great Depression and her funding fell through. Wow, what a great career that is. She's not done. Kind of like hold my coffee, So she gets up again and she moves to Florida and begins to serve among the Seminole peoples there. Now, if you know your Florida history, the Indian Wars that happened in the 1870s and 80s out west, well, they were happening in Florida too, up until the 1920s. So on top of the fact that she's now, involved with the Seminoles, she actually set up the culture, because these Seminole women were very heavily into tradecraft, and this was a way for them to maximize an income stream. So she taught the women in the community how to basically sell their crafts to tourists to establish freedom, economic freedom for the Seminole people.
That's really cool.
Not done yet. Hold her coffee. She turns around again, and she is actually forcefully retired by her bishop at the age of 72, and she's given a residence to basically live in. But then along comes Hurricane Donna in Florida, and she basically oversees the recovery for that in the Seminole community. And on top of that, because she's a huge environmentalist as well, in case you hadn't noticed, she's the one who gives the invocation at Harry Truman's dedication of the Everglades National Park.
Wow.
And she continues to work into her 80s. And finally, in her mission work, she worked until her death at the age of 94.
Wow. That's awesome.
So, and I told these two stories. One is to show how a particular moment in life can be clarifying for us. We're called to do the gospel here and now. That's Warnsley Tomoy. But also, when you look at it, it's like, if you look at the life of Harriet Bedell, she spent the better part of the 20th century basically living the life of Christ as she encountered it, and figuring out wherever she was how to be effective as an example in word and deed of what that is. So when we talk about martyrdom, there's the whole gridirons and burning stakes and all that. But then you also experience someone like this, where there was there risk to life and limb for her? Sure, she could get sick and die. She could experience violence at the hands of people who, it was not a safe country. But at the same time, she put herself in those positions and said, no, I'm going to keep doing the Jesus thing. So how does that relate for us? And I want to give this context. So that gets us to this moment of being St. Peter's. And this happened just a little while ago. I was at a clergy colleague's funeral, and he wanted the old Sunday school tune, I Sing a Song of the Saints of God, to be sung at his funeral. I sing a song of the saints of God, patient and brave and true. That the life of the saints isn't just out there, it's ours as well. And so I was thinking about this as I was preparing this lesson, and thinking about ways that we, together as a church, proclaim the good news. Of course, we do that with sermons, and we do that with lessons and teachings like this, but we also do it with a very simple and profound mission statement, which is welcome home. Like, no matter where you're coming from or who you are, when you walk through these doors, welcome home. If you are coming to Sunday services, welcome home. If you're coming to the shop, welcome home. I had an experience of coming into the shop today because I had to do a couple things over here. And I walked with a young woman in a Rutgers sweatshirt whose name was Molly into the building. And I said, welcome home to St. Peter's. And she goes, it's my first time here. I said, well, I hope it's not your last. Again, welcome home. And there's that. There's also change for change, and the little things matter. You throw a couple quarters into a jar. At the end of last year, we collected enough to send $1,000 in loose change from, basically August to December. We collected enough to send $1,000 match from my discretionary account to the wildfire recovery effort in the Southwest.
That's awesome.
But that's just people reaching their pocket and throwing a couple quarters in. That's all it is. Just a little bit. Helping hands. A lot of people don't know about this. We have a group of people who literally lend a hand. So what that means for the most part is people who crochet or knit or hand loom or tie blankets, create garments for the Seamen's Church Institute for seafarers. Who come into the commercial port of St. Elizabeth, or I'm sorry, not port, St. Elizabeth, Port of Elizabeth, come into that, and we give them hats, mittens, scarves. We make lap blankets for the veterans home. We also make preemie hats and blankets for St. Peter's Hospital, and we also do chemo caps and prayer shawls for people going through cancer treatment. And you name it, like Helping Hands does things, but we also do things like meal trains, where we, someone has a bad diagnosis, and we set up we're going to bring you dinner, or we're going to come and, clean out your yard. It's the spring or something like that. The shop at St. Peter's, everybody thinks of that as a profit-driven enterprise, and it does make profit that supports the mission ministry of the church. But we only make about $130,000 to $140,000 a year in income. I actually sat down with a friend of mine who's an economist, and what we do in terms of giving our hours of labor, which are all donated, volunteer, or the tonnage of stuff we take in and recycle and upcycle, For all that we bring into the church, into the building here every week, we only send out a dumpster and a half. And we recycle by the pound with Helpsy. We have about 18 charities that what isn't sold gets donated through and support. And I actually watched this happen today, wherein, and you see these youth here holding these bags. One of the ministries that we have at Community Hope Ministries, we made all these care packages for young mothers. So there was a woman with a little baby getting things for the family. And one of our volunteers went and got a bag and said, "This is for you." She goes, "Oh, I don't have enough money to pay for that and this." I said, "No, you're not paying for this. Here's some diapers, here's some onesies, here's some burp cloths. Here's a couple toys for the kids." We did that because these youth, and this goes to our Community Hope Ministries crew, they do the Wednesday night supper. They help maintain Alice's Cup and Kelly's Cupboard. So we have an on-site food pantry as well as one up the street, which serve two different communities of people who are hungry. And then on top of that, this lunch bunch of youth who created this ministry themselves. This is all youth created, youth inspired, youth run. They get together once a month and they do these projects. We also have the garden at St. Peter's, which is here, which we produce food for people who are hungry in our food pantries and our feeding ministries. But also we do things, and I know it sounds weird, we do carbon sequestration, because when we take mulch, when we take things like that, we're actually pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it into the soil and recycling that as food. This all sounds like, oh, that's all nice stuff you do, but anybody who volunteers for an organization to do that, can do good works, right? Then you add two words, because Jesus. So the framing of this is when we talk about an example of word and deed of the good news of God in Christ, it isn't just the fact that we're doing good things. Anybody can do good things. Anybody can be a good person. Anybody can be fine. But in the context for us as Christians, as Peter found out, as Paul found out, as we try to figure and struggle our way through in this apostolic succession thing we were starting with, is that the reason we're doing it is because Jesus. Which, by the way, is not an excuse to eat pork roll every day, because God said to Peter, "Get up, kill, and eat." You should probably watch your diet a little more carefully than that. But in that context, understand that we have this opportunity to reframe how we live in the light of God's love for us. And when we do that and share the story, then what we're doing is we're offering up that as word and deed. So you thought to yourself when you walked through the door, "I'm going to have to figure out how to do one of those lay sermons like Rosita did." You may yet be called to do that. But everything we do every day, making mindful choices in our behaviors and the way we interact, frames the gospel for others, which kind of ties into, we seek and serve Christ in all persons, loving your neighbor as yourselves, which we're going to talk about next week. So that's it. Any questions on that?
Any questions tonight?
No,
No.
no.
You're gonna have to marinate in that. You got any? You're not off the hook,
No, I'm good.
Jonathan?
I mean, it made perfect sense.
I think sometimes people feel like they get caught in this established idea that you somehow have to look like a pastor, walk like a pastor, talk like a pastor, squawk like a pastor to be considered a preacher of the word.
Mm.
But instead, what I see here lived out in our tradition, in our baptism, is the idea that we, by the things we do every day, breathe in and breathe out the good news of God in Christ. And as we make those choices, mindful, ethical, spiritually vested choices of where we put our energy, our time, our talents, with the way we aggregate those to be a community of Christ, and wind up finding out that many hands really do make light work, but also more work on behalf of the kingdom. That's great. I've got another story I'll tell next week about this, but basically it's about understanding that we're all small elements of a deeply more profoundly vast, complex structure that moves through time and space. So kind of tying off of that apostolic succession piece, but also the very idea that salvation history goes from the beginning of the world to its end, and that we're part of that whole matrix experience of being able to play a role in our own time and in our own unique way.
Mhm.
You know, we're not all Florence Lee Timoy, we're not all Harriet Bedell, but we're also little Elsie Beckers who, because of macular degeneration and arthritis, could only make 2 or 3 baby blankets instead of a dozen every year. And confessed to me the last time I was with her, she says, I have to confess something. I go, what? She goes, I cheat when I crochet these blankets. I said, what do you mean? She says, I can't see anymore to put the stitch under. So I go over and I'm breaking the rules of the pattern. I said, Elsie, you're crocheting baby blankets blind.
Right?
I think we can let it pass on
Yeah.
that. All right, guys. So next week we will be together for loving our neighbors as ourselves, which is something we all need to practice every day, but especially in our left turns and on pizza night. So take care and God bless. We'll see you later. Okay.
Okay.
Take care, guys. All right, here we go.